This is at the core of this false allegation, seeking to use Israel and genocide in the same sentence. This is not an organisation that should be given any credibility when one considers how easy it is to join such an organisation as a so-called expert. Let's be clear, this is not a requirement on any law-abiding army to advertise where you will be striking terrorists and terrorist infrastructure, and yet Israel has done this in order to try to save as many lives as possible. The court did not consider whether Israel was plausibly committing genocide or whether Israel was committing genocide or any aspect of the merits of this case. There is absolutely no policy of starvation by Israel, and all of the facts go entirely to show that is the case because of the aid that Israel has facilitated into the Gaza Strip. I think it's important that we situate this conversation, our discussion about this false allegation of genocide, in an appropriate understanding of why this false claim is being levied, because inevitably our very discussion of it has that psychological effect of entrenching this idea that the allegation itself has some form of merit, that it becomes, acceptable to use Israel and genocide in the same sentence. That's actually repeatedly been stated as the motivations behind Israel's detractors using this term, deploying it so frequently, so that it shifts the parameters of the debate, or if you will, the Overton window, what it is acceptable to accuse Israel of. And there are a number of reasons that this term is being deployed. Genocide is, of course, the most heinous of crimes. It is unimaginable in its nature in seeking to eradicate a group of people from the earth. And therefore it fits in with the litany of other appalling allegations that are levelled against Israel as being this sort of uniquely evil force in the world. So it certainly ticks that box. But it's also, very interestingly, a form of projection. This is a term used in psychology where people who are guilty of a particular thing accuse their victim, in this case, Israel, of perpetrating the very crime that they have committed against them. And we can talk about, some of the examples of acts of real genocide against Jews throughout history. But this is essentially the Vasily Grossman quote that is often deployed in this context. Tell me what you are guilty of, and I will tell you what you accuse the Jews of. This form of projection and of accusing, in this case, the victims of the very crimes that have been committed against them, accusing those victims of committing those crimes. This is the underpinning of where we get this obscene, abhorrently false allegation of genocide against Israel from. Well, the definition of genocide comes from the Genocide Convention, the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, and it's in Article 2. The most critical aspect of the definition of genocide is intent, and it's intent to eradicate a group, a racial, ethnic, national, or religious group, in whole or in part. And it's the definition of that intention includes the words as such, which are often missed out, which essentially mean that you are seeking to eradicate that group as such. Because these individuals are members of that group, you are targeting them for destruction. And the definition, once it's dealt with that intention aspect, goes on to list a number of acts that are incorporated as long as they are committed with that intention. They include killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring the children of the group to another group. And this definition essentially emerged from the Nazi practice in the Holocaust against, ironically, you may think, the Jews its commission of genocide against the Jews. That is what gave rise to this term. There hadn't, in fact, been a legal lexicon for this practice of targeting a group of people for extermination until Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish jurist, coined the term genocide to provide that reference point for something that many people argue is even worse than crimes against humanity, is rooted in that intention to eradicate a group. And that's recognized, as I say, by Article 2 of the Genocide Convention as intention being the center of this crime. Well, I don't see this as particularly significant in the grand scheme of things because, in a sense, it's pointing out the obvious. But this was a letter by the Foreign Secretary, undoubtedly drafted by Foreign Office officials as opposed to the Foreign Secretary himself, in response to certain questions set out by the International Development Committee in Parliament. And amongst other things, it notes that the UK's official position is that it does not consider Israel as committing genocide. It makes certain other allegations against Israel, but I think it's critical to understand this in the context of other official positions that have come out of even this government, which has been consistent when it says that the legal advice it has received is that Israel is complying with its obligations under international humanitarian law with respect to proportionality and targeting in Gaza. Many people may have missed this, but it was part and parcel of the official position put out by the government when it launched into its arms embargo against Israel. It was clear that so far as proportionality and targeting, so Israel's kinetic warfare in the Gaza Strip, it was satisfied, or at least it did not have concerns. It could not substantiate any concerns that Israel was not complying with the requirements of the laws of armed conflict. So, in this sense, it's David Lammy coming out to set out what the legal position is. Of course, the reason that it has gained so much traction is because it is not entirely consistent with the political rhetoric that we have heard coming out of this government and the former Foreign Secretary in particular. And this highlights, I think, one of the unique aspects of the debate about genocide, that so much of this is not based on facts and it's not based on law. It is based on this political agenda that is being pursued against Israel. In many respects, of course, this allegation of genocide constitutes a modern blood libel against the Jewish state, and understood in that historical context of the blood libels against the Jewish people, these false allegations, heinous crimes that the Jews were alleged to have committed that were always palpably false. This is just the latest example of that, unfortunately. So, contrary to the analysis with respect to Israel, it is without question that what occurred on the 7th of October were acts of genocide against Jews because they were Jews. Now, Hamas, its leadership has made this repeatedly clear prior to the 7th of October, during the 7th of October, and after the 7th of October, where its leaders threatened to commit similar atrocities over and over again, that these were acts that fall under the definition that I outlined earlier. So, acts including killing individuals of a group with the intention of targeting those individuals because they are members of that group. It's in that sense, textbook genocide. So there's no attempt even made to hide the intention behind which, or the intention with which these acts were committed. And that's really why I come back to this concept of projection, because the acts of genocide that were committed against the Jews on the 7th of October are then flipped around, and Israel was subsequently, of course, accused of those very acts itself. And that's not even to speak of the acts that gave rise to the term genocide in the first instance, the Holocaust, and the acts of genocide that were committed against Jews uh, in the Holocaust. So, in both of those respects, this is at the center of, I think, the motivation of the use of this term. But it's also important to recognize what it is that Hamas themselves and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are the terrorist organizations that cross the border, and of course, ordinary Palestinian civilians. Let's not forget how many of those unaffiliated with terrorist organizations took the opportunity to infiltrate into Israel, to rape, slaughter, burn, mutilate, torture, and take hostages. And that is a manifestation of the intense program of indoctrination that Palestinian civilians have experienced for decades. They are taught from kindergarten up to commit genocide, to consider that slaughtering Jews is the highest calling in life, and to consider that if they do so and become a so-called martyr, they will be rewarded for that in the afterlife. And this is something that manifests itself in the Palestinian curriculum taught in UN-funded schools through UNRWA. It appears in Palestinian kids' television programs. We have football teams named after so-called martyrs. So it is really something that is pushed through every aspect of Palestinian education and the broader society. And I think it's important to recall that because of Israel's unilateral withdrawal in 2005 from the Gaza Strip, until Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists brutally abducted the hostages and took them to Gaza, until that point, there was not a single Jew in Gaza. It had been ethnically cleansed of Jews. And for a period of some 20 years, Palestinian kids who had grown up in that environment, in that Jew-free environment, would never have encountered anyone of the Jewish faith, anyone of the Jewish people. The first Jews that they encountered were those that they raped, slaughtered, mutilated on the 7th of October. And that's a very important aspect, I believe, to understand of the factual matrix behind this and how it is that people can be radicalized and indoctrinated to commit these barbaric, medieval style atrocities, to commit this genocide against a people if you have never encountered them before, and if you have been taught to consider them to be evil. That is where this true evil ultimately comes from. Frankly, it's farcical. This is not an organization that should be given any credibility when one considers how easy it is to join such an organization as a so-called expert. And this has been revealed, called out by many on media, social media, who have joined. In fact, I think even Adolf Hitler paid his requisite $30 and joined up. I'm sure this was a made-up individual. The profile picture denoted a Hamas terrorist, complete with his green bandana. So that really should have shot the credibility of this so-called organization of scholars very quickly indeed. But when one looks behind the mechanism by which this resolution was put out, it was passed by a total of 107 voting in favour out of over 500 members. And don't forget, these are members that simply pay, a minimum of $30 to join. So it could in fact be anyone. But when one looks at the actual resolution itself, the whole thing falls apart even further. It's a litany of lies that have been put forward. Plainly no scholarship attached to this at all. Simply accusing Israel of every crime imaginable. But I think there's a very interesting phenomenon at play here in terms of the information referenced in the resolution itself. And these are chiefly reports of NGOs, many of whom have been discredited over the last 2 years. But there's a very particular phenomenon here where we see non-governmental organizations putting out reports that include blatant falsehoods against the Jewish people or against the Israeli army or the state of Israel. And those then get filtered into an, if you will, international system which has a process of seeking to legitimize these falsehoods. And this organization is part and parcel of a sort of cyclical process whereby these reports are referenced not just by groups like this, but also by UN special rapporteurs. They then find themselves in UN Human Rights Council resolutions or even General Assembly resolutions, both political resolutions as opposed to having any legal significance. And then these very references may also find themselves into the opinions or rulings of international courts like the ICJ or the ICC. And then you'll find them again being picked up and referenced by NGOs, many of whom began this process of laundering these falsehoods in the first place. And when one looks at the sources that these NGOs are deploying, that's particularly telling because often they are Hamas affiliated organizations or the so-called national authorities in Gaza, which are, of course, all Hamas. So I think it's very instructive to see that the resolution itself incorporates this Hamas propaganda and seeks to legitimize it through this farcical process and this supposed vote. But we also see remnants of mainstream media misrepresentations being brought into this resolution also, in particular, the big lie about the ICJ's provisional measures order. Its first provisional measures order, which has been repeatedly misrepresented as suggesting that Israel was plausibly guilty of genocide or that there was a plausible genocide in Gaza. I mean, that is a falsehood that has been repeated by some of the formerly most respected legal minds in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. But it's pretty telling that it finds its way into this resolution also. And when we're discussing NGOs, I think it's also important to recognise a very recent development from the United States. This is a decision by Secretary of State Marco Rubio to designate, under a US sanctions regime linked to the International Criminal Court, designate three NGOs who have been integral in weaponising international law and in making false representations to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in order to seek to progress this case against the leaders of the only Jewish state. Those organizations, Al Mezan, Al Haq, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, are very good examples of organizations that have participated in this propagation of falsehoods that becomes part of that cycle of the laundering of these false allegations that I mentioned. Well, let's deal with the casualty issues first. The figures that are often repeated, not just by international courts and tribunals, but of course also by the media and by these NGOs, are those figures that are put out by Hamas. And we know, as has been also established by several independent analyses and studies of the numbers that Hamas has put out consistently across this war, that those casualty figures are false. I mean, to give you one example, after the alleged Israeli airstrike on the Al Ali hospital, this was all the way back in October 2023, and it was reported as such around the world. Of course, that was retracted only once it became clear that this was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. This is another terrorist organization in Gaza. One of their rockets that was fired towards Israel fell short in the Gaza Strip and hit the hospital car park. But that was not before this lie of Israel attacking a hospital had gone around the world, and the Hamas authorities had put out a casualty figure of 500 people that had allegedly been killed in this attack on a hospital. Of course, the attack on the hospital was a complete fabrication, and this casualty figure was likewise fabricated, but it was maintained in official casualty reports since that hospital strike and since, or hospital non-strike, and since, of course, the correction of the reporting. That's just one example of the manner in which these false figures have simply been parroted by the media. We've seen analysis, of course, that indicates there are many fabricated entries, those that have simply been invented, or many duplicate entries. Those Palestinian civilians that have died from natural causes over the course of 2 years have also been included. Those Palestinian civilians, of course, that have been shot, murdered by Hamas. We have palpable examples of that. Most of them, unfortunately, don't make it onto mainstream media because it doesn't fit with the narrative that the media wishes to propagate. But we do have, video evidence of Palestinian civilians being executed by Hamas, being shot, seeking to evacuate areas according to recommendations by the Israelis as they're seeking to protect civilians in the Gaza Strip. And we see them also having bombed fleeing civilians and convoys, even very early in the war. And the Americans also confirmed the veracity of those images and those reports. So those Palestinian civilians that have been killed by Hamas are also included in these casualty figures, and those that have been, I suppose, unintentionally killed by Hamas when their rockets have fallen short in the Gaza Strip, which happens on a frequent basis, they have been included. So on that basis, we know that the casualty figures are significantly less than the official reported statistics. And on the basis of Israeli statistics of how many Palestinian terrorists they have killed, and let's also just remember that the numbers that Hamas put out make no distinction between civilians and combatants. They put out a global figure. But we do know, even taking at face value these false figures and comparing them across the first part of this war, when there was a little bit more known about what Israel was doing in terms of targeting specific terrorists, we know that the casualty ratio. It's terrible to think about it in these terms, but this is what military experts and lawyers in armed conflict do. They look at civilians to combatants, how many have been killed, and the ratio in this case was unprecedentedly low. Figures of 1 to 1 or 1.5 civilians to every one combatant. And the reason I say that's unprecedentedly low is because if you look at the figures put out by the American health authorities with respect to Afghanistan and Iraq, those figures were 5 to 1 and 3 to 1 respectively. 5 civilians for every one combatant and three. So in this context, and we also have to understand the unparalleled challenges that Israel has been grappling with on the ground, and there are other scholars on this subject, John Spencer included, who's head of urban armed conflict at West Point, the military academy. He's made a study of urban armed conflicts throughout history and has highlighted that in this case, the unprecedented use of civilians as human shields by Hamas, where it has embedded itself in civilian areas and used every school, mosque, and hospital in the Gaza Strip as part of its terror infrastructure, where it has prevented civilians from fleeing armed conflict and sought to generate as many civilian casualties as possible. That, in this context, that casualty ratio of 1.5 to 1, or even if it were as high as 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, is still unprecedentedly low in the history of armed conflict and in these particular circumstances of Hamas using these tactics in these areas of these populated areas. They are densely populated areas. This is not the most densely populated part of planet Earth, as is frequently falsely suggested. But these are cities that Hamas has been fighting out of. And in that context, the casualty ratio is unprecedentedly low and testament to what Israel has done in going way above the requirements of international law in preventing civilian casualties and issuing warnings of strikes, losing military advantage through doing so. Let's be clear, this is not a requirement on any law-abiding army. to advertise where you will be striking terrorists and terrorist infrastructure, and yet Israel has done this in order to try to save as many lives as possible, and using precision weaponry, of course. And there are many, many factors that go into the proportionality analysis of the choice of time of day, the weapons involved, the manner in which they are deployed, to minimize what is called collateral damage, civilian harm, as much as possible. Now, that's to do with the casualty figures, the real casualty figures, if you will, and the practical realities on the ground. But when we come on to this issue of what the International Court of Justice is determining with respect to South Africa's allegation of genocide against Israel, it's important to put this into the appropriate context. The reason that South Africa alleged genocide against Israel is twofold. Part of it is to do with what I was speaking about earlier in terms of the projection, in terms of accusing Israel of the worst of imaginable crimes. But part of it also serves a very practical purpose. South Africa's allegation serves as a legal hook to bring Israel to the International Court of Justice. Why? Because both Israel and South Africa are party to the Genocide Convention, and therefore this is a court that has jurisdiction over disputes between member states of the Genocide Convention and issues that arise under it. So South Africa brought this case, and in its first provisional measures order, the court, in issuing these provisional measures, decided this question of plausibility. Now, it has been falsely represented from the very day that this order was issued in January 2024, that this was an assessment of the plausibility of South Africa's case against Israel. And that is not correct. The court did not consider whether Israel was plausibly committing genocide or whether Israel was committing genocide or any aspect of the merits of this case. It simply considered whether the case that South Africa brought plausibly fell under the Genocide Convention, whether South Africa was raising plausible rights. I know that sounds like a technicality, but it is significant, especially when we see, this yesterday's statement by Hollywood A-listers, or when we see the statement by the supposed genocide, so-called genocide scholars organization, or even references made by representatives of supposed allies of the State of Israel around the world, suggesting that the ICJ has found Israel plausibly guilty of genocide. That is simply not the case. And it is part and parcel of the major misrepresentations around the law and the use of the term genocide in international law and the weaponization of international courts and tribunals in these circumstances. Very easy. And if anyone had actually looked at the publicly available data on this, they would be under no illusions. COGAT is the unit of the IDF that publishes on a regular basis updates according to the volume of aid that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip. From the very beginning of this war, it, as of today, sits at over 2,039,000 tons of aid that has been facilitated in. Now, I appreciate that global figure might not mean very much, but we do have detailed analysis of nutritionists, statisticians, those who have looked at various points throughout this war, the volume of aid going into the Gaza Strip and also its calorific content. And a report last year that looked at what had gone in over a period of 5 months determined that actually over 3,000 calories per Gazan per day had been facilitated into the Gaza Strip over that period. Now, that's significantly in excess of NHS guidelines on maximum calorie intake. So the facts are readily accessible. And in terms of international courts and tribunals, it's important to note that they were referenced, for example, by the Vice President of the ICJ, Julia Sebutinde, in her dissenting opinion. They were not referenced by the majority decisions of the court, the provisional measures orders that were issued, and I think that is very telling. What we have had, and this builds on the sort of NGO network and fabrication of falsehoods that I was referencing earlier, we have had organisations like the IPC repeatedly projecting famine in the Gaza Strip on the basis of false and partial information. And in fact, this is an organization that was called out by a UN body, the Famine Review Committee, for being basing its conclusions on only partial information and making implausible predictions. Now, what many of these reports have been based on, the reason it's been called out as partial information, is UN statistics on aid distributed in the Gaza Strip. Pretty consistently, the UN has only distributed about 30% of the aid that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip. And so that's all that's been counted, 30% of what has been facilitated into Gaza. Now, all of this is to say that there is absolutely no policy of starvation by Israel, and all of the facts go entirely to show that is the case because of the aid that Israel has facilitated into the Gaza Strip. That is not to say that there is not deprivation in Gaza. That is not to say that there are not dire circumstances, certainly in some parts of Gaza. It is a war zone. But the reason for that deprivation or those shortages needs to be abundantly clear, and that is Hamas. And I don't just mean because Hamas started this war and has continued to perpetuate it at every opportunity, every single day. Over 700 opportunities for Hamas to have released the hostages, laid down its arms, and ended all of the suffering for Palestinian civilians. On the contrary, it seeks to increase that suffering and perpetuate it. But Hamas has also been stealing this aid. We have irrefutable evidence, videos, statements by humanitarian organizations on the ground that Hamas has consistently been stealing this aid. Some UN statistics put this at over 90% of the aid that Hamas has diverted. And this has a significant impact on the distribution of that aid. So we need to be clear that there are different realms of responsibility here. What Israel has been doing is facilitating aid into the Gaza Strip. It has been inspecting that aid, which is necessary to make sure that weapons aren't being smuggled into Gaza to help Hamas with its war initiatives. But the distribution of that aid has primarily been conducted by organizations on the ground in Gaza. And this is significant, not just because of Hamas's diversion of that aid, its theft of that aid, but also because of the complicity of many of these organizations operating in Gaza with Hamas terrorists. Now, some people may argue, well, they don't really have a choice. If they have to operate in Gaza, then they have to comply with what Hamas asks of them, as the Hamas terrorist organization controls Gaza. But it is important to note, and this also applies to information coming out of the Gaza Strip via these humanitarian organizations, that many of them are indeed complicit with what Hamas are doing in Gaza. And we have evidence upon evidence of UNRWA's complicity with Hamas terrorist atrocities in the Gaza Strip, as well as promoting them through the UNRWA-run schools. So the organizations on the ground have failed abjectly in many respects to get this aid to the Palestinian civilians that need it the most. That is why Israel has supported initiatives like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This was a joint, Israeli-US supported initiative of private contractors whose mission has been to deliver aid directly into the hands of Palestinian civilians to prevent Hamas diversion of this aid. I think in this context, it's also just really important to mention the international law governing the requirement to facilitate aid into the Gaza Strip, and to note that, in fact, despite Israel's unparalleled, unprecedented efforts to facilitate more aid into Gaza than is actually required by the Palestinian civilian population, it has not ever been under any legal requirement to do so. And that is because the article that governs Israel's responsibilities here, that governs the responsibilities of any belligerent in armed conflict, that is Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which talks about the facilitation of aid, humanitarian assistance, foodstuffs, medical aid. That requirement applies so long as there are no reasonable grounds or reasons to suspect that the enemy is diverting that aid. Now, Israel has had irrefutable proof that Hamas has been diverting this aid from the very beginning of the war. And so it's interesting to note that that provision has never applied. Israel has never, in fact, been lawfully obligated to facilitate this aid because no country would ever be required to feed, to support the enemy forces that are fighting it. That is the logic of international law. Nevertheless, because of the humanitarian stance that Israel has taken, it has from the very outset facilitated this aid into the Gaza Strip. It's worth saying a couple of words about the blockade on aid that applied after the ceasefire fell apart. People watching may recall that there was a ceasefire throughout which hostages were released in exchange for many security prisoners by Israel terrorists that have been held in Israeli prisons. And part and parcel of that release were the circus-like events that we saw with these hostages being paraded around by Hamas terrorists, the only time they've ever been seen in uniform for the cameras. And of course, when that release of hostages broke down, when Hamas refused to continue releasing and negotiate on to the next stage of that ceasefire, the war resumed and there was a blockade on aid. The context of that blockade has to be taken into account, and that is that during that ceasefire between January to March, there were 6 months worth of foodstuffs, aid, medical assistance that was facilitated into the Gaza Strip. Israeli officials talked about it in terms of flooding Gaza with aid, but the assessment of the volume of aid that had been facilitated in, over 25,000 trucks, I think it was, is that that was sufficient for 6 months. And that was the basis upon which thereafter the continuation of aid into the Gaza Strip was halted in order to seek to prevent Hamas from obtaining this advantage through its theft of this aid on the basis that the stockpiles in Gaza were significant. At least 5, but in the region of 6 months was the estimate. And I've not heard anyone question where that 5 to 6 months worth of aid went when only a couple of months later international organizations were alleging that there was starvation in Gaza. Consistently, though, those allegations have been proven to be false, and I think it is significant that media organizations have led with image after image of harrowing images, it should be noted, of very sick children, many of them with genetic deformities and genetic conditions that have meant that they appear emaciated, and that each of these children has been used to seek to substantiate this false allegation of starvation in Gaza. The fact that each and every one of these children has in fact been abused by Hamas, these sick children, to be plastered onto the front pages of newspapers around the world, that is very telling of the false narrative around this idea that Israel is subjecting Gaza to starvation. But of course, it defies logic. Images like that generate a very emotional response where reason and logic go out of the window. And that has been part and parcel also of the false allegation of starvation that South Africa and others have been alleging. Well, I think it's important just to address the factual inaccuracies behind these allegations, and that is that South Africa's selective quotation of many Israeli leaders failed to reveal an important aspect of these speeches, these comments, and that is that they were targeting Hamas, not the Palestinian people. And those allegations have been repeated by many in the international community, some so-called scholars. These misrepresentations of what it is that Israeli officials at the very beginning of this war said, that Hamas needed to be eradicated, or that Hamas was being compared to Amalek, a people in the Bible that committed similar atrocities against the Jewish people as the Palestinian terrorists on the 7th of October. So that is significant. But the notion that intention can be inferred simply from rhetoric is without basis in international law. The case law coming out of the International Court of Justice has been quite clear about the high bar that is required to prove intent for genocide. And really, it has to be the only reasonable inference of the conduct that is being evidenced. Now, in Israel's case, its provision of aid into the Gaza Strip, its facilitation of the evacuation of civilians, its extremely restrained approach in targeting Hamas very precisely amongst civilian populations and providing warnings of those strikes. All of the evidence, all of the real evidence, not the manufactured evidence, the false quotes, and the fake numbers that are being propagated here, the real evidence demonstrates that Israel's intention is to target Hamas entirely lawfully, as it is permitted to do under the laws of armed conflict, while it takes unprecedented measures, far more measures than required, in fact, by international law, to prevent civilian casualties, to protect civilians. And that is also buttressed by a lot of the unvarnished testimony that is coming out of the Gaza Strip from Palestinian civilians themselves. Again, testimony that you will not see on mainstream media because it does not fit with the false narrative that is being propagated. But I certainly recall last year Ohad Chemo going into the Gaza Strip, holding out a microphone, and Palestinians who at that point were leaving Jabalia telling Israelis to defeat Hamas, to save them from the oppression of Hamas who were killing them and torturing them, and celebrating Israel's successes in targeting Hamas and in saving Palestinian civilians. From reports of, Israeli army soldiers protecting civilians fleeing through humanitarian corridors, through evacuation routes that are set up by the Israeli army, protecting them from Hamas fire, as these terrorists have continued to fire on their own civilians who are seeking to flee to safety. All of the real evidence points in the complete opposite direction. And so, no, rhetoric, indeed false representations of this rhetoric included, are certainly not of any assistance in seeking to substantiate these false allegations. There is none. But as I mentioned at the start, what we are faced with here is the very discussion and debate that now seems to have erupted over Israel and genocide has already done the damage. When I was on South Africa's national broadcaster the day of the first provisional measures order, my counterpart remarked, "Isn't it marvelous? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence and nobody can tell us otherwise." And this is at the core of this false allegation, seeking to use Israel and genocide in the same sentence, and through repetition of this false allegation, to seek to have it entrenched in the minds of ordinary people. That this is now an allegation that is considered to be credible against Israel, that is an allegation considered to have merit, is a problem, not just for all of those who seek to get to the truth of this situation, but all of those who, in fact, value international law more broadly, and value the concept of having terms, legal concepts like genocide is important in international law, and this gets degraded. It loses all sense of meaning when it is abused and weaponized in this fashion. So that is the real tragedy of the abuse of the term of genocide in this case. Of course, the nature in which it is having such an impact on, public opinion against Israel, and we've seen those who have no clear understanding of the realities of what is going on, Hollywood actors, celebrities, and in fact some politicians jumping onto this bandwagon. This has become the new cause, if you will, and the damage it is doing to the Palestinian civilians themselves, as it is encouraging Hamas to continue its real genocidal war against the Jewish people. That damage is immense.